China quietly made a written promise to Africa 60 years ago, and its repercussions today show how the vast majority of humanity will defeat Washington's attempts to retain supremacy. In this video, we'll show you how the China-Africa friendship is older and deeper than most people realize. And we'll look at a pledge made by a Chinese leader in 1964 that sealed that relationship. But first, the story of humanity this century arguably has three main tales. The economic growth center of this planet is moving to Asia. The demographic growth center of this planet is moving to Africa. And the political partnership growth center of this planet has moved to the BRI, the biggest global trade project in human history, and also, of course, to the BRICs. And what do we find? China is at the heart of all three of these. Then, of course, there's humanity itself. Asia and Africa today make up 77.5% of all human beings, and both regions are growing in population. In recent days, leaders of the African nations met in China to hear a stunning announcement. China has set aside $51 billion to help African nations over the next 3 years. And 33 African nations will immediately get tariff-free access to the Chinese market. This is on top of a huge number of other ties between China and Africa. China has built 10,000 kilometers of railways, created 100,000 kilometers of roads, and laid down 200,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable in Africa. And of course, the Chinese have built ports, schools, hospitals, and stadiums too. But you know what? The key is not money or even infrastructure. It's a deep friendship which comes out of shared history, a long history. China's partnership with Africa is much, much older than people think. Now, the press keeps reporting that the Africa outreach is a strategy by Beijing's current leaders. Not so. It started long ago. In the 1950s, 7 decades ago, many African nations were drawn towards the Chinese model, in which socialist civil servants used capitalist mechanisms to create wealth for the benefit of the people. By the end of the 1950s, China had signed bilateral trade agreements with Algeria, Egypt, Guinea, South Africa, and Sudan. In December 1963, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai started a lengthy tour of Africa, setting foot in 10 different African countries. Now, at that time, Western nations largely ignored both Asia and Africa, seeing them as either desperately poor places for colonial exploitation or rather sad destinations for charity aid projects. The highest level US policy document said that America must work to try to maintain the wealth disparity between the rich West and poor Asia. And that's exactly what they're doing today. But China, seeing Africans as brothers in socialism, had a very different attitude. During the state visit to Ghana in January 1964, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai outlined principles under which China would work with Africa. Now, these precepts, although made 60 years ago, look remarkably modern. Now, this is a list of the pledges. I won't read all of it to you, but I'll summarize the main points. Aid is not about us giving you money as an act of charity, Zhou said. Instead, it's about finding ways two communities can help each other. I call this principle the trade is aid model. Zhou also defined principles about loans. Whenever we loan you money, it will be low interest or interest free, he said. And if you have difficulty repaying it, we'll extend the period as much as possible. Zhou believed that loans should never create a situation where one country becomes dependent on another. Instead, the aim is for the recipient to develop self-reliance, the document says. Zhou also realized that a healthy trade relationship should not just be a case of one country selling machinery or other stuff to another. What is important is to transfer technical know-how, he wrote. Now, the Chinese leader also believed that economic relationships between countries should not turn one into a vassal of the other. Sovereignty must be respected, the pledge says. Now, he specified these principles in this written list of promises made by China to the nations of Africa in 1964. And you can see that they're still used today, although under different names such as, preferential loans, repayment extensions, technology transfer, and so on. What is the West's reaction to all this? Well, the US does a lot of good in Africa too. America is a rich country and probably the biggest cash donor to the African continent. Unfortunately, the US has a tendency to politicize everything and will also use its favorite tools, covert disinformation and demonization. Last time it was reported that the Chinese were working hard in Africa, the US sent Kamala Harris to the scene to turn people against China. Now, that's not me saying that. That's the New York Times. That's the address of Kamala Harris's biggest fan club. Now, look at this 2023 article. Vice President Kamala Harris's visit to Africa last week was designed to send a message. China is not your friend. The US is. The New York Times even recorded a podcast to reinforce that message. China is not your friend. The US is. I think the difference in culture between East and West is clearly encapsulated right there. China is far from perfect, but it does work hard to follow its trade is aid principle, setting up mutually beneficial relationships with multiple countries. In contrast, the US is unfortunately quick to throw away its most fundamental values in the rush to stay number one in everything. Oh yes, they give plenty of aid cash too, but with the money comes a message. Here's some money. Now we want you to abandon your old friends. But the truth has a way of coming out. Even in the New York Times podcast, a speaker went into detail about how China had changed people's lives. He said that it used to be impossible to get to where you were going in Nairobi because of all the traffic jams. Then the Chinese arrived and built infrastructure. Now you can see Nairobi has highways and overpasses and junctions. Listen to what he says.
I used to, for instance, study at a university on the other side of Nairobi, and basically the road that would go to that university was like a 2-lane road, and now it's one of the biggest highways in this region. It's up to 8 different lanes.
Wow.
And so whenever you think about how the traffic in Nairobi was so bad in the past, and how there are all these highways and expressways that are opening up all across the city, everybody just thinks about China. Mm-hmm. Everybody just thinks, oh yeah, it used to take me this many hours to get to one place, right. But thank God for China.
Humanity can have a great future if we help each other in a cooperative way. Let's make sure the warmongers don't take that away. As Lao Tzu said 24 centuries ago, those who advise the ruler on the way do not want the world subdued with weapons, for such deeds bring on retaliation. Thorn bushes grow where armies have camped. Peace.